At 30,000 feet, Sarah's water broke. She was 8 months pregnant, fleeing the husband who swore he'd never let her go, trapped in a narrow metal tube with nowhere to run. The flight crew's desperate call for a doctor brought forward not just any passenger, but Daniel Hills, a young millionaire CEO with steady hands, a medical degree, and a knack for saving lives. What neither of them knew was that delivering her baby mid-flight would be the easy part. The sound of shattering porcelain still echoed in Sarah's ears long after the plate had smashed against the wall. She sat frozen at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the swell of her belly, trying to steady the fluttering kicks beneath her palm. The baby moved restlessly, as if sensing her fear. Mark was pacing the living room, his shadow stretching and shrinking under the dim light. She could hear the uneven thud of his shoes against the wooden floorboards, each step sharp and impatient. His voice had been quiet at first when he came home that evening. Too quiet. But it had risen quickly, each word spat like venom over something as trivial as a misplaced phone charger. Sarah had stopped trying to reason with him years ago. Reason only fed the fire. Instead, she'd stared at the knot in the wood of the table, focusing on her breathing, counting the seconds between his words. It didn't matter what she said or didn't say. The outcome was always the same. A slam of a fist on the wall, a thrown object, a door kicked hard enough to rattle in its frame. When the plate had flown, she flinched but didn't cry out. That had been her mistake before, reacting. Mark muttered something under his breath and stormed out to the porch, slamming the front door so hard the frame quivered. The cold air from outside rushed into the kitchen, brushing against her bare arms. She stayed still, listening to the silence settle. It wasn't just about the plate tonight. It was the look in his eyes before he left, a look she recognized from the worst nights. A look that said she wasn't safe here anymore. Her heart pounded in her ears, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. She stood slowly, her legs trembling under the weight of 8 months of pregnancy. Every movement was careful, not from the pregnancy alone, but from the muscle memory of living in a house where any sound could be a trigger. She walked to the bedroom they once shared, now cold and unwelcoming. Her suitcase was buried under blankets in the closet. She pulled it out, her fingers moving with urgency but precision. She didn't have much time before he came back. Inside went the essentials: her wallet, the small stash of cash she had been hiding inside an old shoe for months, a change of clothes, the baby blanket she'd bought in secret. She hesitated at the edge of the bed, staring at a framed photo of their wedding day. Her younger self smiling so brightly she barely recognized the woman. She left it face down on the nightstand. Her phone was next. She powered it off completely and slid it into the suitcase. No calls, no texts. She knew he'd track her if he could. The plan wasn't fully formed. She only knew she had to get out. Now, in the small hallway mirror, she barely recognized the pale, drawn face staring back. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in tired waves. Her eyes were swollen from months, no years, of silent crying. But there was something else tonight, a flicker of resolve. She took the back door, slipping into the cool night. The grass was wet under her shoes, and the faint scent of rain hung in the air. The streetlights glowed a dull amber, casting long shadows across the empty road. She pulled her coat tighter around her belly and walked quickly toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. Every passing car made her stiffen, but none of them slowed. She reached the bus shelter, sat on the metal bench, and kept her head low. The timetable showed a late bus to the city center, where she could catch a cab to the airport. As she waited, the baby kicked again, stronger this time. "I know," she whispered, resting a hand against her stomach. "We're leaving. We're going to be okay." The bus arrived with a squeal of brakes. She climbed aboard, avoiding the driver's eyes, and dropped a few coins into the fare box. The city lights blurred past as the bus rumbled forward, taking her farther from the house that had been a cage for too long. By the time she reached the terminal, the adrenaline had dulled into exhaustion. She kept her hood up as she moved through the crowd, scanning the departure board. She didn't care where she went, only that it was far enough. A one-way ticket to another city would do. At the counter, she bought the earliest flight she could find. The clerk glanced at her belly, but didn't ask questions, only handed her the ticket with a polite smile. As Sarah walked toward the gate, she realized she hadn't felt this much air in her lungs in years. She was still afraid. Mark would look for her. But with each step, the distance grew. And with it a fragile, trembling hope. The terminal was colder than she expected. Or maybe it was just the air conditioning, turned up high to keep travelers alert in the early hours. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around her and gripped the strap of her worn suitcase. The boarding time printed on her ticket felt too far away, every minute stretching into hours. She found an empty seat near the corner of the waiting area, away from the bustle of families with restless children and business travelers tapping on laptops. Her body ached. The sharp pain low in her back was a reminder that she was running on borrowed time, both in her pregnancy and in her escape. She shifted in the seat, wincing. The baby rolled inside her, a slow, forceful turn that made her breath hitch. She tried to distract herself by watching the people around her. A young couple in matching hoodies shared earbuds and whispered to each other. A man in a rumpled suit muttered into his phone, one hand rubbing his temple. Nearby, a woman with a wide-brimmed hat scrolled lazily through her tablet. They all looked so ordinary, so unbothered. No one here knew who she was, what she was running from, or how the wrong phone call could send her whole world crashing down again. Her eyes darted toward the glass doors at the terminal entrance. She imagined Mark walking through them, scanning the crowd, his expression cold and purposeful. She swallowed hard and forced herself to look away. When the boarding announcement came over the speakers, her heart leapt. Flight 713 to Alderford, boarding now. She had no idea what waited for her in Alderford, only that it was hundreds of miles from the house she'd just left behind. That was enough. She joined the line at the gate, keeping her head down. The woman in front of her had a toddler clinging to her leg, his small face peeking out curiously. Sarah offered him a tiny smile before realizing her cheeks ached from the effort. The gate agent took her ticket, scanned it, and handed it back with a polite nod. "Enjoy your flight," she said. Sarah nodded without answering, her voice lodged somewhere in her chest. The jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and oil, the air warmer than the terminal. Her suitcase wheels rattled on the uneven floor as she stepped onto the plane. The cabin was narrow and bright, the rows of seats stretching like a tunnel toward the back. She found her seat in economy, window midsection of the plane. The man in the aisle seat was already settled with headphones on, nodding to the beat of music she couldn't hear. She slid into the space beside him, arranging her coat over her lap. The seatbelt strained slightly over her stomach. She tugged it looser, glancing at the flight attendants as they moved briskly up and down the aisle. Their smiles were rehearsed but kind, their voices soft as they helped passengers stow bags and find seats. Sarah leaned against the window, staring at the sweep of the wing outside. Beyond it, the lights of the runway glowed in the darkness, little beacons against the night. In business class, separated by a curtain she could just barely see around, a different world seemed to hum, quieter, more deliberate. She caught glimpses of wide leather seats, glasses of champagne, and the low murmur of voices. Somewhere up there, she thought distantly, someone was probably reading a book, sipping wine, waiting for takeoff without the weight of fear pressing down on them. A loud chime signaled the start of the safety demonstration. Sarah barely listened, though she nodded politely when the attendant in her aisle smiled at her. Her hands remained folded protectively over her belly. When the plane began to taxi, the vibration ran up through her feet and into her chest. The engines roared, and the runway lights blurred past the window. She closed her eyes as the force of takeoff pressed her back into her seat, her fingers tightening around the armrest. For a moment, she let herself imagine the line of connection to Mark snapping, like a rope pulled too tight, suddenly breaking. She could almost hear it. The seatbelt sign chimed again as the plane leveled. People relaxed, some unbuckling, others reaching for books or phones. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the clouds drifting outside, the pale horizon breaking into hints of dawn. She told herself she could breathe now, that she was safe, at least for the moment. But deep down, a part of her knew that the danger wasn't entirely behind her yet. Not with the baby coming soon. Not with no plan for where to go when they landed. The baby shifted again, a gentle but insistent nudge against her ribs. She rubbed the spot gently, her lips moving in a whisper no one else could hear. "We just have to make it there," she murmured. "One step at a time." She didn't know that in just a few hours, those steps would be interrupted by something far more urgent than her fears. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Somewhere behind Sarah, a baby cried softly before its mother's gentle shushing soothed it back into silence. The lights were dimmed, casting everything in a muted amber glow. Sarah shifted in her seat, trying to ease the tight ache low in her spine. It had been there since before boarding, but now it was sharper, a dull, rolling pressure that came and went like an unwelcome tide. She thought of it as just another discomfort of the final month, nothing she couldn't endure until landing. The man beside her had fallen asleep with his head tilted toward the aisle, mouth slightly open, music still faintly audible through his headphones. She pressed her palm into the side of her belly, breathing slow. Another wave of pressure came, stronger this time. Her breath caught. She adjusted her position again, but the pain didn't fade as quickly as before. A cold bead of sweat slipped down the side of her temple. "Not now," she whispered under her breath. She turned her face toward the window, focusing on the soft expanse of clouds below. It felt impossible that she could be here, floating above the earth, while her body betrayed her like this. The third wave came quicker. She gripped the armrest, her nails digging into the padded fabric. The cabin suddenly felt warmer, air heavier. She could hear her own pulse in her ears. Then a warmth spread suddenly, shockingly, across her thighs. Her eyes went wide. No. No, no, no. She glanced down. Her coat, draped across her lap, had soaked through in a dark patch. The heat was unmistakable. Her water had broken. Her breath came in short bursts now. She pressed the call button above her seat with a trembling hand. The tiny light flicked on. Somewhere in the front of the cabin, a chime rang. A flight attendant appeared moments later, her professional smile faltering the instant she took in Sarah's restless face and the damp fabric covering her lap. I think I'm in labor," Sarah managed, her voice tight with both fear and pain. The attendant's eyes widened briefly before she composed herself. "All right, ma'am. Just breathe for me. We'll take care of you." She glanced over her shoulder and gestured sharply to another crew member. The announcement came seconds later over the intercom. "Attention, passengers. If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew." The words seemed to hang in the air. Heads turned. People murmured to each other. No one moved. Sarah's breathing quickened. She felt another contraction building, curling through her abdomen and lower back with a fierce, squeezing force. She gritted her teeth. The attendant tried again, walking down the aisle and scanning faces. "Is there a doctor on board?" Her tone was firmer now, urgent. Still nothing. Passengers avoided her eyes. The attendant's lips pressed together before she turned and hurried through the curtain into business class. Sarah caught a brief glimpse, wider seats, hushed voices, and in the middle of it, a man sitting alone, reading a book. He looked up as the curtain swished aside. He had sharp, clear eyes that didn't waver when the attendant spoke to him. "Sir," she said, leaning down slightly. "Are you a doctor? We have a passenger in labor." He closed the book slowly, setting it aside with deliberate care. "I am." His voice was calm, almost steady enough to be unnerving. Without another word, he rose from his seat. The light caught on his wristwatch, sleek, expensive, and on the smooth precision of his movements. Even before she knew his name, Sarah sensed he was a man used to emergencies. When he stepped into economy, his gaze went immediately to her. Not in the casual curiosity the other passengers showed, but in quick, professional assessment. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked as he approached, his voice low but clear. I don't know," she admitted, a tremor in her words. "That's all right. We'll find out." He crouched slightly so his eyes met hers. "You're going to be okay. I'm Daniel." The way he said it, not as an introduction, but as a promise, cut through some of the haze of panic. The attendants moved quickly now, clearing the row of seats beside her, bringing towels, a first aid kit, bottles of water. Someone fetched a blanket from the overhead bin. Daniel slipped on gloves from the kit, his hands steady as if they'd done this 100 times before. "All right, Sarah," he said, already using her name after hearing it from the attendant. "We're going to work through this together. Just keep breathing when I tell you to." She nodded, clutching the armrest. Another contraction came, fierce and unyielding. Her world narrowed to the rhythm of his voice, calm, precise, unshaken by the cramped, swaying space around them. The rest of the cabin blurred into murmurs and rustling. Somewhere far below them, the earth rolled on, unaware of the small, urgent battle being fought inside the narrow fuselage of Flight 713. The aisle around Sarah became a narrow island of movement. Passengers leaned into the gaps between seats, curiosity written across their faces, though most tried to mask it. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the small silences between her sharp, uneven breaths. Daniel didn't waste a second. He pulled a headset from a crew member's hands, speaking quickly into it. "I'll need the captain to notify ground control. Have an ambulance ready at arrival. And warm blankets. Lots of them." The attendant nodded and vanished toward the galley. Sarah's eyes darted between his face and the hands snapping a sterile package open. I can't do this here," she said, her voice breaking. "Not on a plane." He met her gaze without flinching. "You can. And you will. Right now, this plane is the safest place you can be, because I'm here with you." It wasn't arrogance. There was no boast in his tone. Just certainty. Another contraction ripped through her, making her curl forward, gripping the seat in front of her. Daniel slid into the aisle beside her, one knee on the floor, speaking in a low, even rhythm. "Breathe in and out. Good. We'll time the next one." The seconds ticked by. He checked his watch, then gave a small nod to the attendant returning with supplies. 3 minutes apart, he said. "We're moving fast." The blanket was spread across Sarah's lap for modesty. Daniel gently adjusted her posture, easing her backward so he could better assess. The movement was careful, respectful. Every touch deliberate, his focus absolute. She caught glimpses of him in flashes between the pain. The clean lines of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows, the way his eyes scanned her like he was memorizing every detail of her condition. "You've done this before?" she asked, voice shaking. "Too many times to count," he replied without looking up. "And every time, the first thing I tell my patient is this: your body knows what to do. Trust it." The reassurance threaded through the panic, anchoring her. The next contraction hit harder, a deep, primal wave that forced her to push instinctively. A startled whimper escaped her throat. Daniel was already leaning closer. "That's it," he encouraged. "Let your body lead. Short breaths between pushes, like this." He demonstrated, and she followed, matching his rhythm. The attendants worked around him in silent coordination, handing him what he asked for before the words were fully out of his mouth. He checked her progress quickly, then looked up at Sarah. "We're crowning," he said. "1 or 2 more pushes and you'll meet your baby." Her heart pounded. The hum of the plane disappeared under the sound of her own breathing. The pain was blinding now, hot and all-consuming. She squeezed the armrest until her knuckles whitened, a low cry escaping her. "That's it. That's strength," Daniel's voice cut through. "Push with everything you have." The first cry didn't come right away. Instead, there was the surreal sensation of release, the sudden lightness. Daniel's hands moved with quick precision, wrapping the newborn in a soft towel before expertly clearing the airway. Then a sharp, glorious wail filled the cabin. Heads turned toward them. Someone gasped. Someone else began to clap quietly. Daniel's face softened as he placed the small bundle into Sarah's trembling arms. "You did it," he said simply. Her eyes blurred with tears as she looked down at the tiny, red-faced miracle pressed against her chest. The baby's fist opened and closed against the fabric of the blanket. Daniel checked the newborn's breathing, heartbeat, and temperature before nodding in quiet satisfaction. He gave the attendants a subtle signal that all was well. Around them, the murmurs in the cabin shifted from worry to relief. Passengers smiled, some wiping their eyes. Sarah barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to the warm weight in her arms, the damp curls on her baby's head, the rapid flutter of a tiny heartbeat against her skin. Daniel stayed beside her, keeping watch as though nothing else in the world mattered. "Both of you are stable," he said. "We'll keep monitoring until we land." She looked up at him, words caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a single nod, not lingering on the thanks. Instead, he rose, speaking quietly to a crew member about her privacy, his voice taking on a protective edge. In the small, crowded space of row 18, Sarah cradled her newborn as the plane continued to cut through the night sky. And for the first time in years, she felt a fragile sliver of safety. The baby had drifted into a fragile, restless sleep against Sarah's chest, her tiny breaths warm against the hollow of her collarbone. Sarah adjusted the edge of the blanket, tucking it under the infant's chin with a care so light it was almost trembling. The cabin was calmer now. The passengers had settled back into their seats, some glancing over with quiet smiles, others pretending not to notice at all. The adrenaline of the last hour had ebbed, replaced by the soft hum of engines and the occasional clink of a glass in business class. But Sarah's heart had not slowed. Two attendants approached, one carrying a notepad, the other a warm compress. "Ma'am," the one with the notepad began, kneeling slightly so her voice was level with Sarah's, "we're going to need to get your emergency contact information. Family, spouse, or anyone you'd like us to notify." The words hit harder than she expected. Family, spouse, notify. Her grip on the baby tightened. "No," she said quickly, her tone sharper than she meant. "Please don't call anyone." The attendant blinked, pen hovering over the paper. "I understand you might be overwhelmed, but—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice low but firm. "No one. I mean it." The baby stirred at the shift in her tone. Sarah immediately softened her voice, rocking slightly in her seat. "Sure, it's all right, sweetheart." The attendants exchanged a look. One of them straightened, clearly uneasy. "It's just standard procedure, ma'am. Especially in situations like this." Before Sarah could answer, a deeper voice cut in. "I'll handle this." Daniel was standing in the aisle, his presence commanding without being loud. The attendant stepped back slightly as he crouched beside her seat, placing himself deliberately between her and the rest of the cabin. He studied her face for a moment. "You have a reason," he said, not as a question but as a statement. She swallowed. I can't. Please." His eyes didn't waver. "You're safe here. But I can't help you unless I know what you're running from." Her chest tightened at the word running. She glanced past him at the passengers, strangers who now knew her only as the woman who'd given birth mid-flight. None of them would guess what she'd left behind. "I can't go back to him," she whispered, the words almost lost under the drone of the engines. Daniel's expression didn't change, but his focus sharpened. "Him. My husband," she said, the word tasting like ash. "He's dangerous. Last night," her voice cracked. She shook her head as though physically pushing the memory aside. "If he knows where I am, he'll find me. He'll take the baby." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Does he know you're pregnant?" "Yes. He's been." Her throat closed around the rest of the sentence. She didn't need to finish. The bruised edges in her voice filled the silence. Daniel glanced over his shoulder at the attendants. "No calls. No contact. This is a medical emergency, not a family reunion." His tone brooked no argument. The attendants hesitated, then nodded and moved away. Sarah blinked at him, a mix of relief and disbelief settling in her chest. "Why are you?" "Because I believe you," he said simply. "And because right now you need someone in your corner. I can do that." The tightness in her throat made it hard to speak. She looked down at the baby, the tiny features so new and unguarded, and felt the weight of her choice pressing against her ribs. She nodded once. Thank you. Daniel's voice softened, though his posture remained alert. When we land, I'll make sure you get somewhere safe. Somewhere he can't find you. For the first time since the plane had left the ground, Sarah let herself lean back into the seat, her shoulders loosening fractionally. The fear wasn't gone. It wouldn't be for a long time. But for this moment, the relentless tension in her spine eased. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the steady rise and fall of the baby's chest against her own. When she opened them again, Daniel was still there, watching her with that same steady focus. The kind of attention that felt less like curiosity and more like a promise. The descent began with the subtle shift of gravity pressing Sarah back into her seat. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a small, soft cry. The seatbelt sign blinked on overhead. A flight attendant appeared beside them, offering a smaller belt that could be looped around the baby and clipped to Sarah's. Daniel supervised, his gaze never leaving the newborn until he was satisfied with how she was secured. Almost there, he said quietly, as if speaking to both mother and child. Outside the window, the clouds broke apart to reveal the sprawl of Alderford below, gray rooftops, winding rivers, the faint glint of morning light on glass. For Sarah, it was unfamiliar terrain, a landscape with no history. That, she thought, was exactly what she needed. Her stomach tightened at the thought of the terminal waiting beyond the runway. If he had somehow found out, if Mark had guessed where she was heading. She glanced at Daniel. He seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. Don't worry, he said, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. I'm not letting you walk out of here alone. The landing was smooth, though the baby startled at the jolt of the wheels meeting the tarmac. Sarah murmured softly to soothe her, brushing a fingertip over the tiny forehead. As soon as they taxied to the gate, Daniel stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. He moved to the side, speaking low and fast into it, too quietly for her to make out the words. His tone was clipped, efficient. When he returned, his expression had the same calm authority it had carried during the delivery. I've arranged for private transport, he said. We'll leave through a side exit, not the main concourse. The attendants helped Sarah gather her few belongings, her coat, now folded neatly, and the small suitcase stowed overhead. Daniel carried the suitcase himself without asking, his other hand resting lightly against the back of her seat to guide her out into the aisle. The passengers they passed offered quiet congratulations. Some smiled warmly, others simply nodded. Sarah kept her gaze low, murmuring a few polite thank yous without slowing. They reached the front of the plane, where the captain himself waited to shake Daniel's hand and congratulate Sarah. She smiled faintly, but her eyes kept drifting to the windows beyond, scanning for signs of danger. Through a discreet doorway at the end of the jet bridge, an airport security officer waited. Dr. Hills? He asked, addressing Daniel. Yes. This is the passenger I called about. We'll need a quiet route. The officer nodded and motioned for them to follow. They wound through narrow corridors lined with maintenance carts and stacked crates, the hum of the public terminal fading behind them. The smell here was different, faintly metallic, tinged with jet fuel. At the end of the hallway, a black sedan idled, its engine purring. A driver in a dark suit stood beside it, opening the rear door as they approached. Daniel helped Sarah in first, making sure she was settled with the baby secure in her arms. He passed her suitcase to the driver, then slid in beside her. The door closed with a solid, muffled thud, sealing them away from the noise of the airport. The car pulled away smoothly. Through the tinted windows, Sarah saw only blurred glimpses of service roads and security fences. She exhaled slowly, almost without realizing it. Where are we going? She asked. A private clinic first, Daniel said. They'll check both of you thoroughly. No records linked to your name will be made without your consent. After that, I have a place where you can rest. She studied his profile, the precise line of his jaw, the unshakable composure. Why are you helping me like this? He didn't look at her when he answered. Because too many people look the other way when they see someone in trouble. I don't. The driver merged onto a quiet road lined with trees, the sunlight breaking through in fractured gold. Sarah looked down at her daughter's tiny face, the fragile eyelashes resting against flushed cheeks. For the first time since boarding the plane, she let herself believe they might make it through the day without being found. The car turned into a private driveway, its path curving toward a low, modern building with frosted windows. The clinic's glass doors slid open before they reached them, two nurses waiting inside with gentle, professional smiles. As they stepped into the cool, softly lit reception area, Daniel's voice was low and steady. "You're safe here. No one knows you're here except me." For the first time in months, Sarah's shoulders didn't feel like they were carrying the weight of the entire world. The clinic smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic, a strange but oddly comforting combination. Its walls were painted in soft earth tones, and the lighting was warm, not the harsh fluorescence Sarah had expected. The nurses moved with quiet efficiency, guiding her into an examination room while Daniel stayed just outside, speaking with a staff member in a low voice. The baby was weighed, measured, and checked for reflexes, her tiny body swaddled in a warm blanket. Sarah sat on the cushioned table, her bare feet resting on the cool tile floor, watching the nurse's hands with a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Every time a door opened in the hallway, her shoulders stiffened before she could help it. When the nurse finally smiled and said, "She's perfectly healthy," Sarah felt her throat tighten. It was a simple sentence, but one she'd been holding her breath to hear. Daniel stepped inside a moment later, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to her. "Chamomile. Helps calm the nerves," he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world for a millionaire doctor to bring tea to a patient. She accepted it, the warmth seeping into her hands. "Thank you." Once the examinations were finished, the nurse gave her a fresh set of clothes, soft cotton leggings, a long cardigan, and offered the clinic's private shower room. The moment the warm water hit her skin, Sarah felt the grime of the past 24 hours washing away, though not yet the memories. When she emerged, the baby was sleeping in a small bassinet, and Daniel was standing beside it, scrolling through his phone. He looked up briefly. "Ready to go?" She hesitated. "Where?" He pocketed the phone. "Somewhere no one will think to look. One of my properties, quiet, secure. No staff unless you want them. You'll have food, clothes, and anything else you need. Think of it as a guest house with very determined locks." It sounded too generous, too easy, and far too much to accept from a man she'd known for less than a day. "I can't afford that," she said. "I didn't ask you to," he replied. His voice was calm, but there was no hint of charity in it, either. "This isn't about money. It's about keeping you safe until you can decide what comes next." The drive took them away from the city center, past open stretches of countryside broken by clusters of trees. The air seemed clearer here, and for the first time, Sarah rolled down her window slightly, letting the breeze wash over her. The house appeared almost suddenly, a stone and glass structure nestled at the edge of a wooded hill. A high fence surrounded the property, its gate sliding open automatically as they approached. Inside, the space was airy and quiet, filled with natural light. The floors were warm wood, the furniture understated but comfortable. Through the wide living room windows, she could see a sliver of lake glittering in the distance. Daniel set her suitcase near the stairs. "Bedroom's up there. Kitchen stocked. There's a phone on the counter, but it's not connected to any personal accounts. Safe line only. No one can trace it." She looked around, trying to absorb it all. "Why do you have a place like this?" "Sometimes I need to disappear for a while," he said simply, then added, "It's also useful for situations like this." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. That night, she lay in a bed softer than any she'd slept in for years, her baby cradled in the crook of her arm. The silence was so deep she could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside. No footsteps. No shouting. No breaking glass. For the first time since she'd fled, Sarah let her eyes close without forcing herself to stay half awake. And for the first time in years, she dreamed without fear. The days in the guest house began to take on a rhythm, slow, steady, and blissfully predictable. For Sarah, that predictability was a kind of luxury she hadn't known she could crave. Mornings started with the sound of her daughter's soft fussing, the sunlight slipping through the linen curtains. She would make coffee in the quiet kitchen, the scent filling the open space as she swayed with the baby on her hip. There were no slammed doors, no footsteps pacing like a warning. Daniel didn't hover, but he was present in ways that mattered. Sometimes he stopped by with groceries or a new set of baby clothes. Once he brought a second-hand stroller that folded with one smooth click. Practical, he'd said, avoiding her amused glance. It took her weeks to notice how subtly he was laying the groundwork for her future. One afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a printed list of local resources. Women's support groups, counseling services, and legal contacts, alongside an employment agency specializing in remote work. "You should have options," he said when she looked up at him in surprise. "Choices give you control." The words lodged somewhere deep, a counterweight to all the years she'd been told she had none. The first time she left the property on her own, her heart had pounded the entire way into town. She kept scanning the sidewalks, expecting to see Mark's familiar shape in every passing stranger. But the day ended without incident, and she came home with groceries and a tiny knitted hat she'd found in a shop window. Small victories. Daniel never asked about her past beyond what she'd already told him. He seemed to understand that the details didn't matter as much as the direction she was heading now. But he did ask about her skills, her interests, her plans. And when she mentioned that she'd studied graphic design before her marriage, he'd quietly put her in touch with a friend who ran a small but reputable design firm. The interview was virtual. The first time she'd sat in front of a camera in years without feeling the urge to shrink. She got the job. That night, she found herself telling the baby, "We're going to be okay," and actually believing it. Months passed, the seasons shifting outside the wide windows. The baby learned to roll over, then sit up with a wobbly determination that made Sarah laugh until her cheeks ached. And through it all, the invisible line between her and Daniel began to change. He was still the man who had delivered her child on an airplane, still the stranger who had opened doors she didn't know existed. But he was also just Daniel. Someone who checked the locks before he left. Someone who remembered how she took her tea. Someone who never made her feel like a burden. When the call came from the lawyers, she answered it alone. She listened as they told her Mark had been arrested on multiple charges, that his bail had been denied, that the trial would be swift and the outcome almost certain. She didn't cry right away. She walked to the back deck, sat in the fading light, and let the cool air settle into her lungs. Later, she called Daniel. "It's over," she said simply. "I'm glad," he replied, his voice warm but even. "So what's next?" That was when she realized there was a next. She didn't have to wait for someone else to decide it for her. The guest house had been a safe harbor, but it wasn't a destination. It was time to step beyond its walls. The cafe was small, tucked into the corner of Alderford's historic district, the kind of place with uneven brick walls and the scent of freshly ground coffee hanging in the air. The afternoon light spilled through tall windows, warming the polished wood tables. Sarah sat near the back, her daughter balanced on her knee. The little girl was almost 6 months old now, her hair a soft, dark curl, her laughter quick and contagious. She reached for the spoon in Sarah's hand, babbling happily. It had been weeks since the news came, Mark's arrest. The charges were serious, built on more than just Sarah's testimony. Daniel's connections had brought in lawyers who knew exactly how to navigate cases like hers. The day she heard the verdict that he wouldn't be leaving prison for a long time, she'd stood in the quiet kitchen of the guest house, her hands trembling, and let herself cry without shame. Today, she was here to meet Daniel for the first time in weeks. They'd stayed in touch, calls, short visits, but she'd wanted to build some space, to prove to herself she could stand without leaning entirely on him. The bell over the cafe door chimed. Daniel stepped inside, scanning the room briefly before spotting her. He wore a dark coat, his hair slightly wind-tossed from the cold outside. When he reached the table, his gaze dropped immediately to the baby. She squealed in delight, grabbing at his sleeve. "She's grown," he said, smiling in a way Sarah rarely saw, soft or unguarded. She doesn't stop, Sarah replied, adjusting the baby's position. Keeps me on my toes. He sat across from her, setting his gloves on the table. How's the new job? It's good, she said, and it was true. The small design firm she'd joined had welcomed her without question, her work-from-home arrangement allowing her to balance motherhood without losing herself entirely to it. They talked for a while, about work, about the upcoming winter, about the little milestones the baby was reaching. But eventually, the conversation drifted into silence, not uncomfortable, just waiting. Sarah took a breath. I never really thanked you. Not for the clinic, not for the house, not for... You don't need to, he interrupted gently. You did the hardest part yourself. She shook her head. I wouldn't be sitting here if you hadn't stepped in that day. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Maybe, but you were already running before I met you. All I did was make sure you didn't have to keep running forever. The baby reached for his hand, tiny fingers curling around his thumb. He let her hold on, his expression unreadable but softened by the moment. I'm selling the guest house, he said suddenly. Her eyebrows lifted. Oh, it's done its job, he said. And you don't need it anymore. You've built something that's yours. She smiled faintly, feeling the truth of it. I guess I have. They finished their drinks slowly, neither rushing to leave. When the baby began to fuss, Sarah stood, slipping her coat over one arm while settling the infant against her shoulder. At the door, she turned back. You know, you're part of this story now, whether you wanted to be or not. Daniel's smile was brief but warm. Just glad it's a story worth telling. Outside, the air was crisp and clear. Sarah stepped onto the cobblestone street, the baby's small weight balanced against her, and felt the sun on her face. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt open, wide, waiting. She walked on, each step steady, the echo of the cafe door closing behind her fading into the hum of the city. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.